proposal must contribute to a more unified nation. Secondly, it must benefit and accord with the wishes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It must be capable of being supported by an overwhelming majority of Australians. And finally, it must be technically and legally sound. Now, whether or not one participates in this national conversation is a personal choice, but I think that it should be an informed personal choice. And I'm glad to say that the UME Unity website does have a lot of useful resources for all of you, and I would urge you to get onto the website so that you can make an informed decision. On that note, I have to disclose that as a matter of conscience, I won't be participating in this national conversation myself. When Anne originally approached me to speak tonight, I said that I would be delighted to come, but I had to confess that I would not be participating in this national conversation. And that is a matter of conscience for me. My decision is not because of a belief that constitutional recognition of Indigenous people is not important. In fact, I think that it is one of the crucial steps in building a unified nation. But I believe that such an exercise requires all parties to begin from a place of sincerity. And I do not believe that the Gillard government is doing that because of the Northern Territory intervention. The Northern Territory intervention is extremely complicated. I don't plan to monopolise your time tonight by discussing it because I think that this should be a fluid conversation, but I will tell you why I am so strongly opposed to the intervention. But first, let me briefly tell you what it is. The Northern Territory intervention it's a body of almost, its legislative machinery is a body of laws that are almost 500 pages long that was introduced under the Howard government. It began, well, it was conceived, I guess, on the 21st of June 2007, when Prime Minister Howard declared his government's response to what he described as the national emergency of child abuse in Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory. Now, what would become known as the Northern Territory intervention included the compulsory acquisition of Aboriginal lands, the quarantining of welfare payments, prohibitions on alcohol, and for many communities, the complete loss of autonomy. Now, I was one of the ones who opposed the intervention from the beginning. In opposing the intervention, I did not deny that there were very real problems in communities. I also agreed with the recommendations of the report Little Children Are Sacred that spurred the Howard government's response to this. I don't want to hold up the conversation tonight, so I'll briefly summarise what my concerns are with the intervention. Firstly, it stigmatises Aboriginal people. This legislation only applies to Aboriginal people, and its operation is actually defined by reference to Aboriginal lands. So it cannot apply to anyone else. And the implementation of the legislation has stigmatised people who are already stigmatised before. We conducted consultation with some communities a year ago, and what we found was that the greatest grievance for many people was signs that the government put up outside their communities declaring prohibitions on pornography and alcohol, stigmatising all of the Aboriginal people who live there as abusers and alcoholics. Secondly, there is very little transparency in this legislation. By way of example, the Commonwealth Minister for Indigenous Affairs was actually empowered to virtually take over community organisations. The minister can make a declaration, for example, to actually seize the property of these organisations. And it is not implausible that these broad powers could actually be used for inappropriate reasons. I also oppose the interventions because some of the provisions have absolutely no link to child protection whatsoever. And in particular, that was the acquisition, compulsory acquisition of Aboriginal lands. That for many communities are not only the most substantial asset that they have, but it's also the linchpin of their culture and identity. And finally, I oppose the intervention because there is very little evidence to suggest that it's actually yielding positive results. But there is a vast amount of literature now pointing to the adverse consequences of the intervention. The Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, for example, did a health impact assessment of the intervention last year. And it predicted that any health gains brought about by the intervention would be, quote, outweighed by negative impacts on psychological health, spirituality and cultural integrity of almost all the Aboriginal population in the Northern Territory. Now, even the government's own figures are pointing to real harm on the ground. Last year, the government's Closing the Gap in the Northern Territory monitoring report revealed increases in rates of child malnutrition, mental illness, and even attempted suicide. Now, these issues, they're grave issues, and I can see that there is a diversity of opinion in both the Aboriginal community and the mainstream community about the wisdom of the intervention. But because it was rushed through the Australian Parliament 4 years ago, we've never had a public debate. And it is crucial that we have a public debate on this legislation. Until we have that public debate, I think that it's disingenuous to have a discussion about constitutional reform that will try to rewrite the relationships between not only Australian people and Aboriginal people, but also the relationships between Aboriginal people and the Commonwealth Parliament. But that is only my opinion. What is important is for all of you to be informed so that you can then exercise your own discretions. In that light, I'm quite keen to throw it out, throw the discussion out to you, and let's begin this conversation.